He was supposed to be the next big thing, a player so dominant, so electrifying, that even Michael Jordan saw him as a true rival. But before Len Bias could take even a single step in the NBA, everything came crashing down. This is the heartbreaking story of Len Bias, the superstar who never got his shot. Born on November 18th, 1963, in Landover, Maryland, Len Bias was raised in a strong, supportive family. His parents, James and Lenice Bias, instilled discipline and hard work in their children. Growing up in Prince George's County, Bias wasn't immediately recognized as a basketball prodigy. In fact, unlike some of his future NBA peers, Bias wasn't a highly sought-after or praised youth player from the start. In his early years, Bias experimented with different sports. He was athletic but raw, still finding his way. He didn't dominate the competition as a middle schooler, nor was he one of the most talked about young basketball players in Maryland. But what he had was a relentless work ethic, a competitive drive that wouldn't allow him to settle for being average. It wasn't until high school, at Northwestern High School, that Bias began to blossom. At first, he lacked polish. He wasn't heavily recruited. But as he continued to grow, both physically and as a player, everything changed. His athleticism exploded, his confidence grew, and soon, people began to take notice. By his senior year, Bias was no longer an unknown prospect. College scouts started attending his games, intrigued by his raw athleticism, his effortless scoring, and his defensive potential. Though he wasn't regarded as a generational talent just yet, it was clear that he had the tools to become something special. And then, the University of Maryland came calling. In 1982, Bias committed to University of Maryland, choosing to stay close to home at Maryland under the coaching of the legendary Lefty Driesell. He would go from a promising talent to unstoppable force. Bias's freshman year wasn't spectacular. He had moments of brilliance, but he wasn't dominating the game yet. He was still adjusting, still refining his skill set. But those who watched him closely could see that something special was brewing. His work ethic was relentless. His determination was unmatched. And by his sophomore season, everything clicked. During his sophomore year, Bias emerged as one of the best players in the ACC. He had developed a lethal mid-range jumper, a skill that made him nearly unguardable. Combined with his freakish athleticism and powerful dunks, Bias was becoming a complete player. His confidence soared. His name started gaining national attention. At the same time, another young star was taking over college basketball: Michael Jordan. The comparisons between the two began almost immediately. Both were supreme athletes. Both had incredible scoring ability. Both had a killer instinct that set them apart from their peers. When Maryland and North Carolina faced off, it was a must-watch basketball. Fans debated, was Bias actually better than Jordan? And some believed he was. By his junior and senior years, Len Bias was simply unstoppable. He wasn't just a dunker. He had developed one of the smoothest mid-range games in college basketball. He could score from anywhere. He was a rebounding machine. He could lock down defenders. Every night, he put on a show. He averaged 23.2 points per game in his senior year, solidifying himself as the best player in college basketball. In the 1986 ACC tournament, Bias played like a man possessed. He carried Maryland, putting up performances that left fans and scouts in awe. His ability to take over games, to will his team to victory, proved that he was ready for the next level. It was undeniable. Len Bias was NBA bound, and he was destined for greatness. As the 1986 NBA draft approached, The excitement around Bias grew. Experts believed he was a can't-miss prospect, a future All-Star, maybe even a future MVP. The Boston Celtics, fresh off winning an NBA championship, had somehow secured the second overall pick. They knew Bias was their guy, and on June 17th, 1986, it became official. With the second overall pick, the Boston Celtics selected Len Bias. The reaction was electric. Celtics fans celebrated. Analysts predicted championships. Bias himself was ecstatic. He had worked his whole life for this moment, and now he was about to join one of the greatest franchises in basketball history. Inside the Celtics organization, there was nothing but excitement. Larry Bird saw Bias as a perfect player to extend the Celtics dynasty. Bias was supposed to be the missing piece, the young superstar who would take the reins once Bird and McHale stepped away. Everything was falling into place. After the draft, Bias went back to Maryland to celebrate with his friends and teammates. The future had never looked brighter. He was days away from signing his NBA contract, from starting the next chapter of his life, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Part 2. The Tragic Night. June 17th, 1986. A night of triumph, a night of celebration. Len Bias had reached the pinnacle of his young career. Drafted second overall by the legendary Boston Celtics, he was set to join one of the greatest NBA franchises in history, destined to play alongside Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish. The future was limitless, but just 48 hours later, everything would come crashing down. After being drafted, Bias made a quick trip to Boston, meeting with the Celtics organization and discussing the details of his upcoming contract. But before officially joining the NBA, he wanted to celebrate one last time with his friends at the University of Maryland. One last night to enjoy the moment before heading into the world of professional basketball. Bias returned to Maryland's campus where he met up with long-time friends, teammates, and classmates. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just a party, it was a celebration of a dream fulfilled. Drinks were poured, stories were told, and laughter echoed through the dorm halls. As the night went on, the gathering became more private, a smaller group, including Bias, close friends, Brian Tribble, Terry Long, and David Gregg, decided to continue celebrating in the dorms at Washington Hall. And what happens next would change everything. Sometime during the early morning hours of June 19th, 1986, the celebration took a dangerous turn. At some point, cocaine entered the picture. In the 1980s, cocaine use was more common than many realize. It was often seen as a drug of the wealthy and successful, a recreational substance used in social settings. Many professional athletes experimented with it, believing it was relatively harmless. But what Bias and his friends didn't know was that the dose he would take that night would be lethal. At some point in the night, Bias used cocaine, possibly for the first time in his life, but the batch he ingested was dangerously pure, unlike anything his body had encountered before. The effects were immediate, and they were catastrophic. Moments after taking the drug, Bias's body began to shut down. His heart raced uncontrollably, beating at a dangerous and unsustainable rate. He suddenly collapsed, his body convulsing, as his friends realized something went horribly wrong. At 6:32 a.m., a desperate 911 call was made from the dormitory. Bias's friend Brian Tribble, was the one on the call, his voice filled with panic as he pleaded for help. "We need an ambulance right now," he said. "Our friend is unconscious, and we can't wake him up." Emergency responders arrived quickly, finding Bias unresponsive. His breath was shallow and pulse erratic. They immediately began CPR, working frantically to revive him, but the damage had already been done. Bias was rushed to the Leland Memorial Hospital, sirens wailing, the ambulance racing against time. Every second mattered, but despite the best efforts of medical professionals, Bias' condition worsened. For over an hour, doctors and nurses fought to stabilize Bias. They administered medication, used defibrillators, and did everything in their power to bring him back. But the cocaine had triggered a massive cardiac arrhythmia. His heart simply couldn't take it. At 8:55 a.m. on June 19th, 1986, Len Bias was pronounced dead. He was just 22 years old. The news sent shockwaves across the sports world. Just 48 hours earlier, Bias had been on top of the world, celebrating his future in the NBA. Now, he was gone. His family was inconsolable. Just days before, they had watched their son achieve his dream. Now, they were faced with an unthinkable reality. Len Bias, their bright and beloved son, was gone forever. The Boston Celtics were in shock. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Red Auerbach, every single player in the organization had expected Bias to carry their dynasty into the next decade. Now they were left with only memories of what could have been. Fans from all over the country mourned Bias. But he wasn't just a talented player. He was a symbol of hope, of potential, of the limitless possibilities that life had to offer. And now he was a cautionary tale. Part 3. The Aftermath and Legacy. The death of Len Bias wasn't just the loss of a promising young athlete. It was a moment that shook the world. It was a tragedy that left a lasting impact on the NBA, drug policies, and the way we talk about the dangers of substance abuse. His death became a cautionary tale, his legacy a reminder of how quickly everything can be taken away. As news of Bias's death spread, shock and disbelief turned into devastation. How could this have happened? How could a 22-year-old in peak physical condition be gone just days after achieving his lifelong dream? Fans, teammates, and coaches struggled to process the unimaginable. The Boston Celtics were at a loss. They had just drafted a player who was supposed to lead them into the next generation, a player who had the talent to be one of the greatest. Red, the architect of the Celtics dynasty, was particularly shaken. He had personally scouted Bias and saw him as the future of the franchise. Now, he was gone before ever stepping onto an NBA court. At the University of Maryland, the pain was immeasurable. Bias had been the heart of the basketball program, a leader and a role model. His death left the entire campus in mourning, but no one felt the pain more than his family. His parents, James and Lonice Bias, had just celebrated their son's greatest achievement. Now they were planning his funeral. Their grief would soon turn into a lifelong mission to ensure no other family suffered the way they did. In the days following Bias's death, an investigation was launched. Authorities wanted to know what had happened that night, who was there, how drugs became involved, and whether anyone was responsible for Bias's death. Brian Tribble, Bias's longtime friend, was the one who made the frantic 911 call. As details emerged, it was revealed that Tribble had been the one to supply the cocaine that led to Bias's death. This revelation led to an indictment, on charges of drug distribution. Tribble, along with Bias's teammates Terry Long and David Gregg, were caught in the legal storm that followed. Long and Gregg were charged with obstruction of justice for initially misleading investigators about the events of that night. While they received probation, Tribble's case was more serious. However, he was later acquitted of the most severe charges. Bias's death also brought intense scrutiny to the University of Maryland. Investigators uncovered that Bias had been academically ineligible at the time of the draft, revealing issues with how athletes were being handled academically. This led to the resignation of Coach Lefty Driesell and several university officials, forever changing how colleges monitored their student athletes. In response, the NCAA implemented stricter academic requirements for student athletes and enforced harsher drug policies. Bias's death became a turning point, forcing institutions to take a harder look at the well-being of their players beyond just their athletic ability. The tragedy became a driving force behind the United States' aggressive approach of the war on drugs. Just months after Bias's death, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, also known as the Len Bias Law. The law introduced severe mandatory minimum sentences for drug-related offenses, especially for crack cocaine distribution. While it was meant to deter drug use, it also led to controversial policies that disproportionately affected communities of color. Many have debated whether the law helped or hurt society in the long run. While it did bring awareness to the drug abuse, it also contributed to mass incarceration. Even today, the consequences of these policies remain a topic of discussion. Had Bias lived, many believe he could have been one of the greatest players in NBA history. Analysts, former players, and even Michael Jordan himself said that Bias had the talent to challenge the best. Jordan, who once faced Bias in college, once said that Bias was the only player who ever truly scared him on the court. Imagine the rivalry we could have gotten in the NBA. Two dominant players pushing each other to new heights. The Boston Celtics, fresh off their 1986 championship, that could have built another dynasty around Bias. Instead, they struggled in the years that followed, with aging stars and missed opportunities. Len's mother, Len Bias, turned her grief into action. She became an advocate, traveling the country to speak about the dangers of drug use and the importance of making smart choices. Her mission was to ensure that no other mother had to endure the pain that she had suffered. Today, Bias is remembered as more than just a tragic story. He is a symbol of potential, reminder of how fleeting life can be. His talent, his passion, and his impact continue to inspire young athletes. Though he never played an NBA game, his legacy lives on. A legend lost, but never forgotten. The story of Len Bias is one that reminds us of the fragility of life and the choices we make. What could have been will always be the question, but what remains is a legacy that will never fade. So guys, that is the end of the video. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know what future videos I should make. And hey, you can leave a like and subscribe if you want to. That is going to be it. See you guys later. God bless.